All right, so in the last lesson, we learned how to incorporate the Bootstrap CSS framework into our static page. And then we used the Bootstrap framework to incorporate a fairly decent looking table. It's simple, right? But we put a table in here, and then we were able to populate the table with our data from the back end. You're going to hear me refer to this term back end a lot. And a little later in this lesson, I will go into a little bit more depth about what I mean by that, the back end, though you've heard me kind of say already that I basically just am referring to the Java code that we are using, okay? But I'll give a little more nuance to it later. All right, so now in this lesson, there are a couple other things that I want to do first right off the bat. The first one is, let's get rid of these additional static or dummy table rows here, okay? Per my discussion earlier where I said one of the nice things about using Thymeleaf is that we can work hand in hand with a web designer or somebody who's delivering the HTML to us already looking beautiful, but we may have to go back and forth with them. So they would prefer that when we modify these files and then they try to use them again to look at them in whatever tool they're using, we haven't like broken everything for them. So we don't want them to break anything for us, and we also shouldn't be breaking anything for them, right? So how can I leave these static records or these static rows here, but I don't want to see them in my version of this code, right? How can we do that? Well, Thymeleaf has an attribute that we can use to do exactly that, to just get rid of certain HTML elements that we no longer want to see when we are running in Java. And that attribute is called th:remove. And we need to specify something here. We need to tell it, well, how much to remove. And in this case, I wanted to remove everything contained within this element. By the way, let me introduce another term that I just used twice now. So this tag here, another word for it would be an element, okay? And so this tr element here contains all of these child elements underneath it. And so when I specify to remove all, I'm saying get rid of the table row element and everything contained therein. So that will result in all of this being removed, the whole entire table row and all of the data cells inside of it, okay? So I can do that, and then I need to do it again right here as well. All right, and so if I restart, there we go. So now those are gone for us when we're running in Java. But if I were to open up this people.html file without a Java application server parsing it using Thymeleaf, and I just opened it up statically in a web browser, it would look as it did before. And in fact, let's see if I can do that real quick here. If I jump back over here, let's see, I might be able to open this in a static browser. Yeah, now you can't see what I'm looking at here because it's running off the page, but I'm going to tell IntelliJ to open this file up. Yeah, there we go. Well, you can see that. Okay, so I just told IntelliJ to open up this file in an external web browser on its own. So it's not being interpreted via Thymeleaf and Java, okay? It's just being served up as a static page. And now you can see all of the original markup that was in that little snippet of HTML that I originally copied from the Bootstrap documentation, okay? So if the designer had given me this is what they're still going to see, even though I've actually come in here and marked it up quite a bit with extra Java Thymeleaf-y stuff, right? But they don't have to see all of that. Now they will see my markup changes, and they probably won't like that either, but at least it doesn't affect how everything displays, all right? So just wanted to show you that and make that point. This is quite great. All right, let's see. So now the next point that I want to show you is I don't like these dates. I want these dates to be in a different format. So let's talk a little bit about how I could change this. There are a few options that I have here. So one option that I could use to change these dates would be, and this would be one that you'd know how to do without me teaching you any new techniques at all. You could just go into the people class. So I will jump over there, right? Or I'm sorry, the person class, right? You could come into the person class, and do you know what I'm going to say? you could just add in a new getter method that returns the date of birth as a formatted string, right? You certainly could do that. In fact, let's just do that real quick. So I'm going to make a new method, and it's going to return string, and we'll call it get formatted DOB. And then we will return, and I will make a new date time formatter instance, and I'll do a custom thing. Let's see, of pattern, and I will specify a pattern. And so let's have a pattern of like the month spelled out, followed by the day, comma, and then the year in 4 digits, okay? And then we can do a format and then pass in our date of birth field just like that, okay? All right, so that would format the date of birth as a string. And then we need to jump over to our template here, and then we'll need to tell it now, don't get the date of birth from the DOB field anymore, because that is an actual date time object, right? Or it's a local date rather. We want you now to get this from the getter method called formatted date of birth, okay? So let's restart and see what that does. Yeah, so that works, right? So that was pretty easy to do. Now, that was easy to do, but don't do that. This is bad. And so now let me go into a long explanation. Hopefully it won't be too long, but let me go into an explanation of why this isn't great to do. And to explain this, I'm going to have to bring up some pretty pictures. All right, so here I have painstakingly created this possibly overly complex looking diagram, but it will serve hopefully many purposes throughout our discussion of these concepts. So what I am showing here is a number of things. We've got our web browser here. I'm showing how the web browser sends requests to our application. So all of this stuff here represents our application. I suppose I could have put another box around all of that and said application, but that's all right. I can just use my words. All right, so this all represents the application, and then the application responds to that request eventually with a response, which is the HTML that should be rendered on the web browser page, in that particular case at least, okay? But what I really want to talk about right now is the idea of architecture of your application, okay? And I've very briefly mentioned this a few times throughout this course, very, very briefly, but now we'll go a little deeper into this conversation, okay? So in application development, and particularly in web application development, there are patterns that have evolved over time that inform us on how we might best architect our applications, okay? And one of these patterns that has become particularly well known in the web application development world is known as the 3-tier architecture, okay? So 3-tier architecture. And what that basically refers to is a way of grouping up your application code into 3 layers, if you will, or tiers. You will generally have the presentation layer, which is this layer here. Okay, so I'm showing these 3 layers kind of horizontally. Okay, you could have them vertically or horizontally. It's all just concepts, right? But so I've got a presentation layer here, which for our purposes means web stuff. Okay, do the web stuff. Okay, then we've got a business logic or an application logic layer. It'll be called different things in different documentation, but the word logic will often be there. Okay, so you'll have this layer here. And then you'll have often a data access layer. So if you're going to be talking to a database, code that knows how to talk to the database would be here. Or if you're getting data from some external sources like some web service, if you don't know what I'm talking about, just think of servers on the internet that don't return pretty pictures in a web page, but instead they just return raw data that other computers can consume, okay? So maybe like the Weather Channel might have a web service that you can grab data from to find out what the weather is in a given zip code or something like that. or Yahoo, or what is it, finance.yahoo.com might expose a web service that gives you real-time stock information if you send them a ticker symbol or something like that, okay? So this is a depiction of the standard 3-tier architecture. Now, our domain model, such as the person class, generally belongs to the business logic or service layer, or whatever you want to call it, this middle layer here, okay? However, as you see that I have depicted it here, it can often sort of transcend multiple layers. So even though I and many developers will consider that the domain classes belong to the business logic layer, they can make appearances in the presentation layer and or the data access layer as well. So here's the problem. If the domain model belongs to this service layer here, it could be considered somewhat inappropriate to make meaningful changes to your domain model purely to satisfy what you need or want in the presentation layer, okay? It's not the end of the world to do. We really just did it just now, but you should kind of think about such changes before you make them. So in our case, we wanted to make what I would argue is purely a cosmetic change, okay? It serves no functional purpose whatsoever. It's purely just, I prefer to see dates look this way rather than some other way, okay? It's cosmetic, okay? So a cosmetic change of this sort definitely falls within the presentation layer, okay? It's how we're presenting things, okay? It doesn't necessarily have anything to do with actual functionality at all. It's just making things pretty, right? Or making things look the way that you want them to look. So ideally, if changes are needed within our application to make data look a particular way, and that data happens to be coming from our domain model, which belongs to the business logic layer, it is generally preferred that we make such changes somewhere up in here in the web layer and not down here in the business logic layer if we can help it. So having said that, the question becomes, well, how do you do that, right? How do we make the date of birth field of the domain model class person, which belongs here, how do we make that field display differently without making any changes to the person class itself? Thankfully, there are actually a number of ways to do exactly that. And now I will show you some. All right, so here we are back in the IDE again. So first thing I want to do is get rid of this. So don't ever do this. Don't add methods and change things in your domain classes just to make things pretty if you know some alternative ways of doing it. If. All right, so I'm going to get rid of this. And then I will jump back over here to the template. And where did I do that? Right there. And I will put this back as it was. Okay, so there we are. So the first alternative technique that I will show you has to do with the Spring framework itself. The Spring framework knows that this can be a problem, and so they have given us great solutions for solving it. So one of these solutions is to define what the Spring framework calls a formatter, okay? And we just created a date-time formatter ourselves, but now we're going to make use of a Spring formatter, okay? And the way that we can do this is, well, the way that I'm going to do it at least, is I'm going to first create a new package over here. Let's see, I guess I'm going to just highlight the web.controller and do a Command N, and I'm going to create a new package. Now I don't want this under controller, but I do want it under web, and I'm going to call this formatter. Okay, then I'm going to create a new class under here, new Java class, and I'm going to call it local date formatter. And now I'm going to specify that this class is going to implement an interface called formatter. And I want to make sure that I'm specifying this from the org.springframework.format package. Okay, so I want to use the Spring Framework notion of a formatter. Now it's just an interface, so it doesn't actually do anything, okay? Notice, however, though, that it is a generic interface, meaning I can specify a data type. to be associated with this. Now, can you guess what that data type should be? Okay, did you get it? So the data type should be, or the generic data type should be local date. All right, so we're saying that we want a formatter that knows how to format a local date. And what a formatter is meant to do in the Spring Framework is to take a type, such as local date, and give the Spring Framework a way of converting that type into a string. That's all it's for, okay? Converting some type into a string. Now I'm getting the red squigglies because this is an interface and I haven't implemented the interface methods yet. So I'm going to do an option return and choose implement methods. And now it's telling me I can implement these two methods here, parse and print. All right, and so I will go ahead and click OK. Now what these two methods are for is for going from a string to our local date and then from a local date to a string, okay? Now the only one that I really care about right now is the print method, which goes from a local date to a string. So let's start there, okay? And for now, we'll basically just do the same thing that we already did in that, what was it, the method that we just created a bit ago, right? So I will create another date time formatter dot of pattern dd comma yyyy, and then format and then object, like so. And I got that object because that's coming from up here. That's going to be passed in from the Spring Framework itself, and it will be a local date because this is a generic data type, right? Now, to go the other way, we can do that as well. And you've had plenty of practice at doing this, I think. Let's see. So there's a couple ways we could do it. I could just use the date time formatter again in that way, or I could also create a local date dot parse that text, and then pass in an instance of a date time formatter. Now, for now, I will use that same format, but however, you can already see that I'm about to duplicate, right? And we shouldn't duplicate. So what I really should do is grab all of that and extract that out into a field of this class so that I can reuse it across both of these methods, right? So I will do an option command F for field, and it's asking me where do I want to initialize it. Now I don't want to initialize it in this method because then it won't be initialized when I use it up here in the parse method. So instead I will change this to, I can go ahead and just have it initialized in the field declaration in this particular case because I can do it in one line, okay? And then I will hit return. All right, and so there's our date time formatter right there. And now I can just refer to that guy, date time formatter, like so, okay? And I don't have all of that duplication. Now, that's not quite enough. In order to actually use this, I will need to annotate it with @component. Now, what that's going to do is, let me explain something else here real quick. The Spring Framework is highly dynamic. It is able to find what are called beans, which are really just Java classes or instances of Java classes, okay? It's able to find Java classes on what is called the class path, and that is just where all of the Java classes live when your program starts up, okay? Java finds all the classes that make up your application and it loads them into memory essentially, okay? Now Spring has the ability to search throughout all of those classes and look for classes that have special annotations that are meaningful to the Spring Framework. And one of those special classes is component. And when it finds such classes that are marked with component or controller, or there are lots of annotations, service, we'll probably look at that a little later, repository, things of this sort. When it finds those kinds of classes, it can also check to see if those classes implement interesting interfaces that it knows about, and it is the Spring Framework, okay? So in this case, this local date formatter is implementing a Spring Framework interface called formatter. Spring knows what to do with formatters. It knows that whenever we are, let me jump back over to the controller here. Whenever we have a controller that is putting a bunch of data inside of a model so that that data can be relayed back to a web page or a templating engine in this case. What Spring will do in this case is it will see that we have registered a formatter for local dates. And so it will realize that these date of birth fields here are of type local date. And so it can actually pass these local date instances into our newly created formatter, and it will call the print method, and it will allow our print method to convert these into strings for us so that they can be displayed more nicely in this case, in our template, okay? Without us having to modify the person class directly. That's the whole point, right? So we can get these formatted arbitrarily however we like without having to modify the underlying domain class, which is person, okay? So we need to jump over to the Thymeleaf template here. And now this date of birth field here, person.dob, we need to tell Thymeleaf we no longer want to display the date of birth field directly. We now want Thymeleaf to ask the Spring framework to convert this field for us, okay? And the way we can do that is to simply select all of this and then wrap it inside of one more set of curly braces. So having a field wrapped inside of two curly braces tells Thymeleaf to ask the Spring framework to perform a conversion of some sort on that field, okay? And that's where our formatter class will get an opportunity to spring into action and do what it does best, which is to convert a local date into a string, okay? So if we restart now, look at that. We get the same output, the same nice output that we wanted before. However, now this time we didn't have to go change the underlying person class, okay? All right, now there's one other way that we could have done this. I'm gonna just mention it, but we're not gonna actually do it. The other way we could do this is purely with Thymeleaf itself. So the Thymeleaf framework has all kinds of capabilities built right into it. And one of those, so if I come over here to the documentation down at the bottom in the appendix, there are all kinds of functions and things that we can do. And it's got functions for doing date stuff. So we could do a dates.format like this, and we can specify format strings much the same as we are doing with our date time formatters, right? So you got that right there. You're passing in a date object and then the format that you want, okay? So we could do that too. I'm not gonna bother with it though, but I'm just showing you that's yet another way that you could do this, okay? So you got lots of options there. All right, let's jump back over. Okay, so now why don't you try formatting the salaries, okay? Now that you've seen the basics of this, can you get that salary field to format in whatever way you like? So take a moment to do that. Okay, did you get it? All right, so I will do this now as well. And we're gonna get a little bonus lesson here, something that I hadn't been able to show you much because it wouldn't have made much sense until we got to the browser here, okay? So we're gonna do the same basic approach. In fact, I will go ahead and just start off with the template here and wrap that inside of the curly braces, okay? Now, right now, that's not gonna do anything. So if I refresh, yeah, no real change there, right? Because I don't have a formatter declared yet, all right? But I will go ahead and create one now. So I'm gonna come up here to formatter, new Java class, and this time I will do a big decimal formatter because that was the underlying data type, all right? And this implements formatter of big decimal. And we will import the big decimal class and then the formatter, and then we will implement the methods there as well. And let me make some room. And here's the one that I really care about. And so for this one, I will create a number format under java.text, number format dot currency instance. Now, one thing that we haven't spent much time really looking at because it didn't make a whole lot of sense until now. We've done this get currency instance bit a lot. However, you will notice there's another version of the get currency instance, which takes a locale, okay? And up until now, we didn't have a whole lot of need for that. I have mentioned it briefly, but we didn't have a great way to really play around with this. But now we're about to. So what I'm gonna have you do, you may not have done this, and that's fine if you didn't, but now you have a reason to. I'm going to actually select that version of the get currency instance, because if you notice up here, we actually have this thing called a locale that's being passed into this method, and we can actually pass that down into the get currency instance method here, and then we can proceed with the rest of what we would normally do, which is the call format. And then we can pass in our big decimal, which is this object instance here, like so. Now, this locale is aware of what area of the world your browser is in, okay? And your browser is actually capable of sending that locale information every time it makes a request back to the web server or application server, or in this case, our application. And the Spring framework, Spring MVC specifically, knows how to grab hold of that locale information and make that available to us in methods like this. What this means is, if you are in the United States or North America, and you're running this application on a browser, and you format the salary using this code, you will get, well, here, let's just go ahead and run it and see. So let's annotate this. Remember that, right? We have to annotate this as a component, okay? There we go. And then let's restart. Hey, there we go. And now we've got money formatted properly for North America, right? That's what I wanted. But now, if you're following along with me and you don't live in North America, but you did all of these steps, you're probably not seeing $, comma, blah, blah, blah. You're probably seeing this information formatted for wherever you live. Now, there could be two reasons why you'll be seeing that. You may be thinking, well, I already was seeing everything formatted for wherever I live, even in the previous lessons where we were following this, because by default, the get currency instance method, even if you don't pass in a locale, will make use of whatever the local system settings are on your computer. However, if you were to allow this application running on your computer to be seen by the entire internet right now, and people who live in other regions other than you were to point their browser at your program running on your computer, they would not see whatever you are seeing, presumably, if they live in a different enough part of the world. They would see these values formatted for them, okay? Because we are now passing in the locale information, which is coming from their browser. And in fact, I do want to show you that real quick. So I'm going to make this bigger a little bit, and I'm going to bring up some information. I think I showed this to you already a little bit, but so every time we refresh the page, if I go to the network here, and I will just, we'll refresh this page this way. Okay, so I just triggered the web browser to make a request back to the application to get this HTML here, okay? The page information, right? The data. Here's that request down here in this line called people. And if I click on that, I can actually see a little bit more of what was sent in that request right here under request headers, okay? And let's see, one of the things that should be in here, there it is, accept language, EN-US. That, my friends, is locale information. It's saying that my browser is set up for English in the United States. That's what that's saying. And so that information right there is getting parsed automatically by the Spring framework and matched up with a known locale. So there's a database in Java that knows that currencies for the US should be formatted like this, okay? So that's how the application, our application, can know how it should format things like dates, numbers, whatever, money, according to the standards of a particular part of the world. That information is typically conveyed within each request that the browser makes back to the application, okay? So just wanted to give you a little bit of insight into that. And so I think that's enough that we've covered for now in this lesson. So join me in the next lesson and we will implement some more functionality. And keep in mind, where we're heading with all of this is we're going to implement a fully functional CRUD application. So right now, all we've implemented is a little bit of reading, the ability to read some data, okay? And it's static data from the back end, in fact, okay? But we're gonna do a lot more with this. So I'll see you in the next one. Hey guys, thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this content and you'd like to help me out, there are several ways you could do that. First, you can always click the like and subscribe. That'll help me out a lot. Additionally, another way you can help me out is to check the link in the description below. That'll link you to my website where you can find additional courses. And finally, for those of you who might be interested in starting a new career as a professional software developer, I offer a free PDF guide that will detail exactly how you can get started in this field with no college degree and no prior experience. All you need to do is click on the link in the description below. Thanks again, and I'll see you in the next one.